Well, hello geometry. Welcome to another week. This week we're talking about parallel lines and their angle relationships. So these videos, while this week is focused a lot on vocabulary, I'm focusing more on the algebraic aspects in these videos, but I'll still be covering some of the academic vocabulary as well. To start, we're looking at the question, what are our parallel line angle relationships? So let's start with parallel lines. And I'm sure that if you haven't already, you're going to do it as soon as I say it, is to look at our document that has a list of all the vocabulary words for this week. It has the diagram, has a description, it has everything that you need there. So you can study just that and you'll be in great shape. Parallel lines are lines that never cross. They're always equidistant from one another. And so here's a great example. Two parallel lines going in the same direction. They are lines, so they go forever in both directions, so they have arrows on either ends. Like we've talked about in previous videos, you can name parallel lines with just a single lowercase cursive letter. So L and M are common ones, but you can name them really any lowercase letter you like. You identify parallel lines either by just saying it, but what you'll see more common is a number of arrows written in the middle. The number of arrows match the parallel lines to another, like when we talked about last week and the week before with congruency dashes. The number of dashes matched up everything else that was congruent to it. So here, if I put on two arrows, every other line with two arrows on it will be parallel to it. Next is the word transversal. And here I'm actually just going to keep in this same diagram because a transversal is related to parallel lines. I know, big shocker with the unit that we're in, parallel lines. The transversal is any line that crosses parallel lines. And it is a line, so it goes on forever, but it could be a line segment, and it just has to intersect both parallel lines. And so any line that intersects a pair of parallel lines is a transversal. Next, we're going to be talking about congruent a little more formally. Congruent means same, like we've talked about before, but it's different than equals. Congruent means same size and shape. So to put that in a practical application, it means that we have two things that are separate things that are the same size and shape. When we talk about equal, a way that I like to think about it is that equal means the same thing. An object is equal to itself. I have a post-it note. It's only one post-it note. This post-it note is equal to itself. But as soon as I have two post-it notes, gasp! Now they're congruent. These are two separate post-it notes that are the same size and shape. They're congruent because they're two identical but separate objects. Equal is the same object. And so, when we say congruent, it means the same, but we're talking about two separate physical things. The other thing to compare here is supplementary. Supplementary, like if you were to go and purchase a supplement of some kind, or if you supplemented something, it means to complete something. And so what we're completing in this case is a straight line. A straight line has 180 degrees in it. Why does it have 180 degrees? Because that's half of a circle. And 180 degrees is half of 360. So When we talk about supplementary angles, we're talking about two angles that add to 180 degrees. So it could be, fancy angle over here that happens to be 50 degrees, and then another fancy angle over here that happens to be 130 degrees. Those add up to 180, so they are supplementary. This particular example that I'll go ahead and point at in purple here is a special one because they're not just adding up to 180 degrees, but they're also next to each other. So we're going to be talking about that in another example as well. But the key piece to take away here is that it is an example of supplementary angles because they add up to 180 degrees. Now, to use this example like I have here, another way to describe it is with the word adjacent. Adjacent means next to. So it is next to an angle, or an angle is next to a different one. When you look inside the notes, it says that they share a point and a ray, which makes sense, right? If angles are next to each other, then they have to share a line. That's our ray. And they have to share a point, and that point is called a vertex. And so two adjacent angles, angle A and angle B here, have to share a ray and a vertex. If I take the previous example, the supplementary angles, I'll go ahead and point at them in green. If I take these two angles, even though I drew them next to each other, 50 and 30 are next to each other, they are not adjacent because they're not attached, because they're not sharing that vertex and ray. So these are not adjacent. Because they don't share that vertex and ray. But these angles up here are adjacent. They're adjacent and they make a straight line. And so not only are they adjacent, but they're also supplementary. So that means if we take the 50 and the 130 that we talked about earlier, 50 plus the 130 is equal to 180. That's what it means to be supplementary. It adds to 180. Adjacent means they're next to. So when you combine those two into a powerful combination, we get a new vocab word. If you are both supplementary and adjacent, we describe that as a linear pair. So if you are both adjacent and supplementary, you're talking about a linear pair. Now put those words together. It is a pair of angles that makes a line. Linear pair. And so a linear pair is both adjacent and supplementary. When you take a quiz, when you take a test, and it asks you for all of the words that describe the angle relationship, you want all three of these. You want all three of these because all three of them can describe this angle relationship. If I just pick a favorite number, let's call this 30, so that means this is 150. That angle relationship is a linear pair, which means it's adjacent and supplementary. All three of those words apply because adjacent and supplementary means linear pair. When you talk to other math people about angle relationships, you only need to say linear pair because it means the other two things. And so the 150 plus the 30 is equal to 180. That works because it is supplementary. They are next to each other, so they are adjacent. And when those two things happen at the same time, you'll always get a straight line. Last example is actually using the word opposite. If adjacent means next to, opposite means away from. If you're on the opposite side of the room, it means you are far away. If you're adjacent to me on the same side of the room, Key point there, you're on the same side, you're next to. So vertical angles here are the case where they're opposite. They don't share a ray. They are not next to each other. Instead, we talk about vertical angles when we have two straight lines and we have angles that are across from one another. They're on opposite sides of that angle. And so you have one on one side, one on the other side. Vertical angles will always be made by two straight lines, and they will always be across from one another. And the other more important piece is that vertical angles, because the lines are straight, are always congruent. I'm going to use the congruent symbol there. They're always congruent. And so the angles that are opposite of one another, the vertical angles, are always congruent. Here's a non-example just to help hammer in what I'm talking about. Here's one straight line. Here's another one, but it doesn't go all the way through. And so there's a separate line that's on the other side, but it is not part of the same line. So we do not have vertical angles because those angles are not the same size and they're not formed by two straight intersecting lines. So these are not congruent because they're not formed by two straight intersecting lines. Hey, thank you guys. Just to hammer in this detail one last bit, if this is 45 degrees, it means the other one's 45 degrees, because that's what congruent means. It means the same. It means that they're not equal, but they are the same size and shape. And so the numbers will be equal. 45 degrees on one side is 45 degrees on the other side. I hope that helps. In the next video, we're going to pick up with some more parallel lines, but these are some great angle relationships taking us to there.